Pastor Kelly. Welcome to the Conversations podcast. This is it. This is the format that we love to do, where we just get to sit down with speakers, pastors, authors, and just to dig into their brain a little bit, how they function.
That could be scary.
How they do ministry. But Pastor Kelly, you are the campus pastor for our Rancho campus, and you have been for
4 years.
4 years. Wow.
Yeah, I know.
4 years.
Flies.
Whoa.
Today is 5 years for me on staff.
Whoa, no way. Well,
like,
happy work anniversary.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you're still here, so it's a good sign.
That's a good sign.
I just wanted to have you on so that people get to know more about who we are as a church, but also each campus is definitely, it's one and all, but each campus definitely has their distinction.
That is true.
Something about them that is just, when you walk into that campus, you're like, yeah, I'm at One and All, but I'm at the Rancho campus, which I love. And that's something that you've built for the last 4 years.
Yeah.
And so, just to talk about yourself, kind of like, how'd you get to be the campus pastor? Because I know it wasn't your
typical
first
route.
thing. Yeah.
No, not at all. I've actually been at Rancho since it opened, which we're going on 11 years.
Yeah.
And, we used to attend, my family and I used to attend out here in San Dimas. And when they opened Rancho, they asked if any of the families live on that side of Claremont, would you consider helping us to launch that campus? Well, my house is literally right next door. Like, I can look out my front door and hear when the band is rehearsing. So, we were definitely close enough to make the move. And so we've been there since my kids were really small and the campus was really small. And we've seen a lot of evolution there and even a few different iterations, I think, before we kind of hit our stride and figured out what works. Multi-site was a very new venture for our church in general. And throughout those years before coming to this role, I served. And serving is such a huge part of my story and kind of stepping into my purpose and realizing that God could use someone with a past, and it's been a great adventure. And then eventually, like, I had served in so many different roles, from helping out at VBS in the summer to putting up Christmas decorations to serving coffee. And it was kind of the coffee thing. I think I had reached a point in my life. I was homeschooling my kids. I had been in the construction industry for 15 years. I have a few contractor's licenses, fun, strange fact. But I really wasn't sure, as far as my role as a Christian, like what God's purpose was for me. I worked in a really small office. I didn't come into contact with a lot of outside people, homeschool in my house, So, we had gone through a lot of changes at the church, and the person who had been responsible for making coffee was no longer around. And I really like coffee,
Nice.
So I had been praying to God, though, and our family had been considering a move out of state. And while we were out of the state traveling, looking at properties, God kept waking me up in the middle of the night and saying, "No, I just want you to grow where you're planted."
Wow.
And I was like, okay, I don't know what that means, but I don't know what to do. And it was kind of like, well, just be obedient and say yes.
Yeah.
And so I always tried to see a need and fill it if there was just something that needed to be done. And we needed coffee because we didn't have a cafe, and I really like my caffeine. So I said, hey, would it be okay if I just show up early on Sundays and make the coffee? And they said, sure. And then a couple of weeks later, they approached me and said, would you actually be willing to put together like a hospitality team of people to help you make coffee? I said, okay, sure. And along that time, I had happened to picked up a book that was on my husband's nightstand that had been given to him, and it was just sitting there, and it was about building teams, teams. And it had never been on my radar. I was an athlete growing up, so I'd captained teams and things like that, but I became fascinated by this book. And so I took the responsibility seriously and just started inviting people that seemed sort of like they weren't already serving, they just kind of showed up on Sundays. And before you knew it, we had a team of like 40 people with rotating teams to
Yeah.
make coffee. And then we added muffins and fruit and things. But I discovered in that, hey, God had, I guess, kind of equipped me
Yeah.
and for that. And from there, they invited me, would you consider leading women's ministry? And I was like,
That's right. Yeah.
yes. God said I had to say yes. But no, it ended up being a really big blessing through that. I discovered that, I really enjoy um, transparency and
Mm,
authenticity.
mm,
I said I didn't want to lead a Stepford Wives club,
yeah.
And so we did a women's brunch, and that was the first time I stood up in front of a very large group of people and gave my testimony.
Well,
And there's a lot of stuff in my testimony,
mhm.
I've made my share of mistakes. I've dealt with, addiction
Yeah.
and some other things, and that's what had prevented me from
Mhm.
stepping out. What if people reject me? But uh, I got such a positive response, and it was so freeing. And people were like, "Oh my gosh, me too. I didn't know that
Yeah.
anybody dealt with that." And and from there, it led to community groups. It was just this constant organic evolution
Mhm.
until before you knew it, I was overseeing community groups and they had invited me to come on staff a few times. And I thought, no, like I'm homeschooling my kids. That's where God has
Yeah.
called me. And that season, again, naturally kind of came to a close. My kids decided they wanted to go to high school and the time was right. And so I made the move. And then I was asked to be campus pastor, which is still just so surreal. It,
Yeah.
it, it blows my mind. And, because I didn't go the seminary route. I mean,
Mhm.
I've always been one of those kind of, I love learning. I
Yeah.
read a lot, but I didn't go through the typical route to get there.
Yeah.
Like I said, I come from construction. Like that was not my plan. I have a marketing major, marketing degree, but I had a deep love for that community.
Yeah.
It's where my kids had grown up.
Right.
We live next door. It is literally my community. But the people there, I
Mhm.
had grown, I really love them. They're my friends. And yeah, so then fast forward 4 years later, and I mean, I started campus pastoring. They announced me the first weekend out of COVID. So it was definitely trial by fire. Like that
Right.
was not the ideal time to start a campus pastoring journey,
Yeah.
but it taught me so much.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Um, yeah, that must have been a wild experience to be thrown in
Yeah.
during the pandemic like that of like, "Hey, by the way, here's your campus pastor," and also you have no prior pastoral experience,
No.
and, like, that alone before COVID is, like, a lot to
Yes.
understand, but then you throw in COVID
All
and
the
all of that.
nuances and
Now, I mean, I guess it kinda sets you up pretty well because now it's almost every pastor was on the same
yeah, it
level.
leveled the playing field.
Correct, yeah, and so it's like, well, even though you're new at pastoring, I could still learn from you, whoever is, like, an experienced pastor
Right.
or somebody that's like, I can
It was a
actually we're
very different
learning
ball game.
together.
Yeah, and it was interesting too because they had approached me before COVID and asked if I'd be willing to take the role.
Mhm.
And then COVID happened. And well, you can't make a big switch like
E
that
correct, yeah.
over Zoom. So,
Yeah, yeah.
but during that time, I had assumed the roles,
Mhm.
Pastor Rory has always been, just so encouraging for
Yeah.
me and giving me the opportunity. Hey, Kelly, why don't you host this weekend? And I'm like on stage with a microphone. You want to give me a microphone? But just getting me to step out and take risks
Mm,
and depend on God
yeah.
because all of those things. And I'm one of those people who like I don't like to do things sometimes if I don't think I'm going to do them well. I'm
Oh,
your
uh-huh.
typical textbook
Yeah,
overachiever,
yeah, for sure.
and so but I really had to lean on God
Mm,
because he filled in the gaps
right.
constantly. He
Mhm.
still does today. And so the first, I remember him coming and saying, "Okay, we want you to go live on Facebook every day for 20 minutes and give a daily devotional." I was like, okay. I mean,
Right.
that's a pretty, I felt comfortable talking to people, but I wasn't sure that I was equipped or qualified to talk to them
Mm,
about God,
mm.
you know? I didn't want to lead anyone astray. I take that
Yeah.
responsibility. But what it forced me to do was I dove deep
Yeah.
into the scripture and just started like
Mhm.
trying to learn as much as I could. And I'm still learning so much. But it through that, it gave me the opportunity to step into that realm
Yeah.
and build some of that confidence
Right.
and realize like, and I've just always been tried to be straightforward. Like, yeah, I'm not Charles Spurgeon,
Right,
like,
right.
but we'll figure it out together.
Correct.
And I've got God's word to guide me
Yeah.
and things. So, but yeah, so it was definitely coming out of COVID. It was like launching the church all over again
Correct.
because so many people had moved
Mhm.
out of state in our
Right.
area, especially, or moved to certain churches,
Yeah,
right?
different
That were
churches that are
very
closer.
outspoken on certain topics.
Yeah.
And so it was like building a team all over again.
Correct. Yeah. Which I feel like that kind of helps you not only try to fit into the church mold,
Yeah.
where you actually got to be like, hey, this is one and all. This is a brand new position. I
Yeah.
want people who are going to be on board with our vision and
Yeah.
what we want to do.
Exactly.
So I feel like, I mean, with every church, with every new pastor
Right.
coming in, there's always going to be some form of tension.
Yep.
But I feel like for you, when you stepped into that, it's like, hey, we're truly doing this together,
Right.
and we're learning all of this. Which, yeah, like how was your experience doing that?
Well, there were so many unknowns as to how people were going to respond. I mean,
Right.
I was the first female campus pastor.
Yeah.
They had seen me
Mhm.
there, which on one hand, I think that helped me because
Mhm.
I had an established relationship with people.
Yeah.
I
It's huge.
wasn't an unknown coming from the outside.
Correct.
I had the opportunity to build trust
Mhm.
and relationships with these people. But in the same sense, I was like, are they going to ever will they be able to see me as Pastor Kelly?
Yeah.
Or am I just like, Cassie's mom, Kelly, and Eric's wife, Kelly, and the chick
Yeah.
that's a coffee fiend that likes to make coffee? You know what I mean? To
Right,
switch
correct.
that perspective. But I was so blessed, and I
Yeah.
think God was really in it, and everyone was so great, and there might have been some that weren't, and they
Right.
just left. I don't know.
Correct. Yeah.
But yeah, it was an exciting journey. We got to
Mhm.
build teams from the ground up for
Yeah.
people who really also had a heart for that community.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's been a blast.
Yeah. I was thinking, like, a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about what it means to be a pastor.
Right.
And of course, scripture says that they are on a higher level, not looking down at people, but more in the sense of, hey, we're responsible for
Right.
what we're teaching and how we're showing and being the example of Jesus.
Yeah.
Absolutely, we are held to those higher standards.
Yes.
But at the same time, people have a misconception of you are the end all be all. You're the one that's as close to Jesus, more closer than any of us.
Right.
And it's so weird.
I was reflecting on that actually this morning in my devotional. It was talking about that myth, right? The holy guy
Yes,
myth,
correct,
that somebody's closer. And at the end of the day, it's the priesthood of all believers,
Right.
And
Mhm.
every person. And I have seen God work through the parking lot attendant
yeah.
and the person in the cafe
Yeah.
and some chick that came out of construction that with a crazy past. So I think that it takes all of us,
Mhm.
and that's one of my favorite things about the local church. And we are
Yeah.
so blessed that we have great teaching pastors, and
Mhm.
Pastor
Right.
Jeff. And being a campus pastor, because it's too hard. He only has so much capacity. When you
Correct,
pastor a church with
yeah.
thousands, there's no way you can have those personal relationships
Right.
with each individual person.
Right.
There's no way you can be the one to go to the hospital when the
Yeah.
mom's on hospice,
Mhm.
or to, go and pray over a new baby, or
Yeah.
those kinds of things. And I know sometimes people are like, but I want Pastor Jeff.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I understand that.
Correct.
Right? But in the same sense, it's a blessing to be the campus pastor with, and I'll be honest, now we're up to about 1,000 people on a weekend.
Yeah.
It's hard for me even to
Mhm.
get to the 1,000 people.
Correct.
So it's all about building the team and
Right.
relying on people who have the hearts for each of
Yes.
those individual areas and they have the giftings and all of the things. There's no way I could do it without them.
Yeah, correct. And it goes to show like, pastors aren't supposed to be the ones that have to do that.
Right. My job is to hopefully equip those at our church to do that and care for them. And
correct.
And we're blessed by a lot of really passionate, talented people, as are all the campuses. And it's necessary.
Oh, truly. And it's like one thing I've learned being in a pastoral role is teaching that the church isn't the building, it's the person.
It's the people.
And it's the people. And like when you really get to teach that and get to show that towards the congregation, then they realize like, oh yeah, I'm within the priesthood.
Yes.
I can share the gospel message. I can share the love of Jesus.
Absolutely.
Like you don't need us per se to step into every conversation.
Right. And that's one of the things, like, first of all, COVID taught us a lot of those lessons.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you were forced to be the church without a building.
Correct.
So how do you go about doing that?
Yeah.
How do you go about maintaining those connections with the congregation so that there's a few people left when you come back to the building?
Yeah.
But just also because everybody was hurting, people craved those connections. And then also because of my journey in my past, like I've done a lot of work when it comes to healing and recovery and things. And that has taught me to be okay with my story.
Yeah.
Excuse me, because I'm no longer the person that I was 15 years ago.
Right.
And it has been in those conversations with people where I've sat down and I've been willing to open up and share my story that I've seen God work. And I've seen him redeem my past and use those things that I often wondered, like, why in the world did I go through that? Well, now I see why, and I think there's a lot of value in, we're all just jacked up people trying to make it through and keep our eyes fixed on Jesus.
Right.
And we can either pretend that we're not, which I think pushes a lot of non-Christians away because they think it's this unattainable ideal, or that if I go, I'll be judged, or God, my story's over. God can't use me. I've made too many mistakes. And so I think it's been such a blessing to me to be able to show people like, well, that girl's up on stage with a microphone. Like if they'll let her do it, there's hope for me too. And it's been so cool.
Yeah. Something we were talking about earlier is about like the local church, like the local community. And you're really passionate about like where you're at, where you're placed, and to be within that community. I think pastors can sometimes have that bigger picture mindset of where it's like, I'm planted here, but our service is going to go in the nations,
or God might take me next week, might have a better opportunity for me.
But the importance of understanding, no, God placed me in this place right now to help shepherd these people in this community. And you're passionate about that. If you want to touch up on that.
I am. Like, none of us know where God is going to lead us in the future. I mean, someday he may, lead me elsewhere, but it's very hard for me to imagine doing what I do anywhere other than Rancho. Like it just, that's where I grew up, like as a Christian. And these people, like I said, they are my family. Like we've walked through difficult times. I have 3 teenagers. You better believe like I value my village, and I've had the opportunity to walk through those things with others, whether it be marriage difficulties or deaths, or, if you hang out in a church long enough, you see people come and go and it's heartbreaking, but that's life. Right. And just being able to, like, they're literally my church family. And I have a great family, a great normal family, but I'm doubly blessed. And, I love, so outside of my passion for my work and my kids, like I've discovered I have this love for like gardening and chickens. And I call myself a wannabe homesteader on my little 8,000 square foot lot in suburbia. But I'm growing where I'm planted.
Yeah.
But with that being said, I grew up in Southern California. I've lived within like a 15-mile radius my entire life. I haven't gotten too far outside of my travels. But I have always been enamored with this idea and that fantasy of small town life, right? I even took a 3-week road trip one time and I said, I'm only going to stay in small towns because I wanted to experience small town America.
That's awesome.
And the thing I think that's always enamored me with it is the idea of just that community, that tight-knit community where you do celebrate births and weddings and deaths. And you've got the local butcher who that's his body part in that body, like in the church, that's what he's good at. That's what his thing, his contribution. And then you've got the teacher, you've got all these different things instead of just the giant Walmart, right? That like provides everything to the community. I think that's kind of the cool thing about the local church too. And I think COVID taught me that as well. Like, are we willing to step in and actually be the church and be the, or are we expecting the big church conglomerate to just feed us things? Right. And during COVID, all of a sudden we had no choice but to band together and do those things for each other. And so, but for me, like I said, God has never seen fit to move me to that small town. So for me, the campus has become that small town. It has filled that need of my heart that I have for that community. And I think especially in Southern California, like I have lived in the same house for 15 years and I love my neighborhood, but I'll be honest, we're probably like the annoying, outgoing, friendly people on the street because everybody else like pulls into their garage, the garage door comes down and we're like, hi. Right? But no, it's just, it's hard to find that. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've become so tribalistic in our setting. But the church is the place where we can kind of put a lot of that aside and come and just be there for each other and love people in spite of our differences. Like, I don't, greet everybody. Hi, my name's Kelly. I vote this way. How do you vote? Like, that's not the main thing. The main thing is Jesus. And so that's that unifying force across our small town, that it's just really beautiful to see it play out.
Right. Wow. All of that is awesome. That's truly like, when you think about a pastor or you think about the pastoral role, like that's truly a pastoral heart, is the local community, pastoring where you're at. You said two things that I really liked what you said. You said valuing the village. And I just think we don't see it as much. It's whatever the pop culture is like, those are the hot topics. So we're just always going to talk about that, but that's not going to help the average family who's struggling with either finances or struggling with kids that are being influenced by other things. And it's like, okay, cool. Thanks. You taught me how to vote away, or you know what I mean? You used all these bigger languages, want to talk about certain people, celebrities, and then bring in the gospel at the end. Like, okay, wonderful. We already have the gospel message within us. That doesn't help necessarily, but your approach is saying, no, I value the people that are coming to this church and I value where they're at, which I think is so powerful.
And I think it's when you do life with others, no matter where they are on their journey, if it's someone who's brand new on their journey, I think it's through doing life together that you have the opportunity to share your experience in your heart. And a lot of times you'll find that God presents an opportunity to share the gospel. It's like, well, you're talking to someone and they're like, yeah, I'm going through this difficult challenge in my marriage and I'm really struggling to figure out how to go about forgiving my significant other. And all of a sudden you're like, well, this is how my faith has helped me to forgive others. And then it kind of opens that door. And no longer is it just you're approaching someone in the checkout line, which if that's what works for you, that's great. But you have the opportunity to establish some trust and relationship. It's cliche, but they say no one cares what you know until they know that you care. And it's by doing life with people that the opportunity will present itself. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, that's interesting. She didn't just fling Bible verses at me. She actually stopped to sit and tell me how this has played out in her life. And, and whether that's been, like I said, recovery or kids or marriage or or just my faith journey or serving or whatever it
Yeah.
may be, there's a lot of, if you're willing to be real with people and
Mm.
open and take time to stop and get to know people. And I'll be the first to admit, I don't always do it perfectly.
Mm.
Like, it's hard. It's hard. Sometimes I come home and I'm like, it was a very people-y day today. I need to just like sit alone in my room and zone out on my phone for 15 minutes.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is my goal, is to see people, and that's been a topic that God has been bringing to the front and center, whether it be through my Bible reading or
Mhm.
conversations or books or things I see on TV, and that's usually how God speaks to me. And so that's something that I'm trying to figure out how to do better, because at the end of the day, each of us only has so much capacity for
Mhm.
relationships.
Mhm.
I mean, sometimes I'm like, shoot, I haven't called my mom in a week, right? Like because I've got 3 kids, I've got a husband, I've got my mom, I've got an aunt who's senior
Yeah.
who doesn't have any children that I try to, maintain a relationship with, like plus my church, plus
Yeah.
all these things. And at the end of the day, there's only so many hours in the day that I have to share. So one of the things I'm passionate about is, how do I do better as a leader, or how do we do better as a campus or a church?
Mm.
And sharing that and helping to facilitate that. So I
Yeah.
might meet a new person on a Sunday, which I meet a lot of new people on Sundays. How do I help to facilitate those connections and relationships with others
Mm.
in my small town, so that they can build a relationship with them? And then now the church goes from a place where they're just coming to hear a really awesome message and experience really awesome worship, but it's a place where their friends are.
Mhm.
That's their community. Because then when the church pushes me outside of my comfort zone and says, this is how you're living, but this is how the Bible says you should be living.
Mm.
Well, in our society today, it can be really easy to be like, ew, you made me uncomfortable. I don't like what you have to say. I'm going to go to that other awesome church down the street where I can forget about what you've asked me to do, and I'm just going to move along, right? It's that I'm just going to go church shopping.
Right. Mhm.
But here at ONE&ALL, we're so passionate about discipleship. Well, in
Yeah.
order to grow in my journey with God, that means I've got to step outside of my comfort zone.
Yep.
And God has shown me that. I mean, believe me, I have been sent to Siberia outside of my comfort zone sometimes. But am I willing to stay in the uncomfortable
Yeah.
and let God work on me, or am I just going to
Mhm.
run away? Well, if I have friends in that church, if that's my community, if that's where my people are, there might be times that the church makes changes that I don't love,
Yeah.
because maybe they just hit close to home for me.
Mhm.
I'm like, but I loved that ministry. That was my one little pet ministry, right? And now for the greater good, or for the goal of attaining our vision,
Yeah.
we've had to adjust directions. Well, am I willing to sacrifice that, or am I willing to stay even when those things go away? Well, yeah, I am, because this is where my community is.
Yeah.
If my sister does something that gets on my nerves, I don't just go shopping for a new family,
Right.
right? If they decide to serve spaghetti instead of ham on Christmas, I'm like, not like I'm out of here. No,
Right.
because that's my family. Those are my
Correct.
people. And I think
Mhm.
it's the same with the church.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. I was thinking of doing life together,
Mhm.
and I was just thinking of like Genesis of Adam and Eve in the garden, and they were stewards of the ground.
Mhm.
But the thing was, is that God didn't leave them to just be like, yeah, do whatever you
Right.
want. Obviously he had the boundary set. He said, you can be here. But the great thing about that is that he was actually doing life with them.
With them.
He was in the garden with them.
Right.
They were going on their walks. And we know that because he showed up for his walk after
Right.
they had sinned. And I just think that's a beautiful picture of what the church needs to be, is understanding like,
Yeah.
we're not just doing this thing just to do it.
Right.
We're doing life together, but we're doing it with God. And because he's
Absolutely.
with us, and because he's within us, like that's where our light shines the best.
Yes.
And so I think you're painting that picture so perfectly.
And I think you're right, because like I said, I come from a marketing major. I'm a researcher. Michael Chisaka laughs at me because I like research everything.
Yeah.
But I think, keeping track of metrics is good.
Yeah.
Because then we know if something is effective to a certain degree or not. But there's also a lot of things that you just can't measure.
Right.
You can't measure all of the seeds that are planted or all of the people that came along and watered that seed before it bears fruit.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean they're any less important, right? Like the lady in my congregation that just happened to have a conversation with the person at Starbucks. Yeah, she may not lead them to Jesus at that moment, but that doesn't mean she's any less significant than I am, because I stand up and I get to present the gospel.
Yeah.
Right. And but I also know no matter how many strategies that we develop as a church, no matter how many programs we have, at the end of the day, if God's not in it, it's not going to be successful.
Right.
And that's another area where I've tried to grow and say, okay, Kelly, slow down. Like, yes, you thought about this. This seems like the most, I don't know, the most
like effective
or most obvious solution, but have you prayed about it? Have you slowed down? Because I can be like quick. I have a long to-do list. So I'm like, okay, check on to the next thing. But if I don't leave the margin for God to work because I'm too fast to jump in and try to do his job for him, I see that even though I might have a good result, maybe God had a better result in mind and I just cut him off at the pass.
Right. And
so these are all lessons that I'm still learning. But it's all about, are we doing it with God? And that's why I think it's so important that we keep the main thing.
Correct.
I have political opinions. I like to stay informed on things.
Right.
But there's a lot of other channels that I go to get that information.
Right.
That's not what I look for when I come to church on Sunday.
You're correct.
You know what I mean? And I'm grateful for that because especially during COVID, I started to experience a lot of anxiety and I had to create boundaries for myself where I said, okay, this is how much time I'm going to spend on Twitter or X or whatever it is. And because so much of that was causing me a lot of anxiety. I'm a people person. And during COVID, I was like, I am ready to move to Alaska and move off the grid and like grow out my leg hair and wear Carhartt overalls and just get me away from people because the world seemed crazy.
Right.
And it still does sometimes, right? But I felt my heart changing.
Yeah.
I could see where the enemy was working his way in. And all of a sudden, me who loves people didn't want to be around people anymore.
Right.
So I was so grateful. And I'm still so grateful to have a respite, a place where I can go and focus on God and love people who don't vote the same as me. And I think especially during this season, that is so important. And that's not to say that we as American Christians shouldn't, like Pastor Jeff said last week, and do our due diligence.
Correct.
Or stay informed and involved. And, I think of Bonhoeffer.
Correct.
So I think it's important, but I also think it's important that especially in the aspect of the church, like we maintain that boundary, like I had to impose for myself, where people who don't think like me or vote like me or come from different experiences that I just haven't experienced myself, can come and experience Jesus. And I know that while I might have opinions, I can go on social media and spout those off. I don't want that to ever be a barrier for when people meet me. They're like, I don't want to go to her church or I don't want to listen to what she has to say about Jesus because that's what they see first.
Correct. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's honestly a really, really good point because some churches tend to present the issue first or the opinion first rather than allowing to teach the Bible and to teach the way of Jesus. Which, and again, it's like, no, locally minded is so important because it's like, I care about this community and I care about the government and what they're doing and how they're doing it. But at the same time, I understand that the kingdom that I want is Jesus' kingdom.
Right.
I don't want anybody else's kingdom. I don't even want my own kingdom, even though some days you're like, this would be better. But
right.
but you have to really humble yourself and allow Jesus to dictate exactly how you communicate to other people, especially who are strong-minded. And let's be honest, the campus that you have, the area you have, produces a lot of it has a lot of strong-minded.
It tends to be, a slightly more conservative demographic. We're in different counties, and I just think, and when I think about where I can affect the most change, like, I'm not gonna, as one person, change the outcome of a vote on the floor of the Senate, right?
Right.
But I can change the outcome of a day for a family that is stressing about how they're going to go buy groceries because we have God's pantry. And that's really fulfilling.
Right.
And I also just want to say there are churches who have taken different approaches to the topic.
Correct.
And it can be easy to become frustrated with those churches because it seems like they're not going about it the same way.
Yeah.
And I like to tell myself that, okay, maybe that's where God has called them.
Yeah.
Right. But God has called us to fill this space.
Right.
And so I am so glad that, God can use all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And I'm glad that there are those places where staunch Republicans or Democrats can go because that's what they're seeking.
Right.
But in the meantime, God has a way of working his way in. And that might be where they hear the gospel for the very first time. I heard the gospel for the very first time sitting at a women's breakfast after being invited over and over and over again to church with a friend of mine who happens to speak Spanish and English. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to converse with her. But finally accepting the invitation and sitting, and only to find out that this whole women's breakfast was in Spanish. And I'm like,
great. Yeah.
My extent to the Spanish language is what I can read on a menu at a restaurant. And so, but the lady next to me translated into my ear. And that was the first time I had ever really heard the gospel, and God allowed me to hear grace and love and mercy. Because while I believed in God, I saw him as a judging God, and a God that I had disappointed, who had probably was so disgusted with me that he didn't have time for me anymore. And so that was the beginning of my journey. And so you never know when, like, God is not going to use those churches to affect the same thing. And just like we have a lot of denominations, right? And I think that it's all part of God's plan.
Correct. Yeah. Some way or another, God is orchestrating his spirit to work in people, to know his love, to experience him, to have that holiness over them.
Right.
And I think so far you have done such a great job with that campus.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
It's very much a team effort.
Yeah.
Correct. Like I said, I love the campus and I am still growing. And there's some times where I'll be in a meeting and one of my team members points something out and I'm like, oh, you're right. Like I need to do that better. Or it's a journey. We're all learning as we go along.
Correct.
And I'm grateful for God's grace and for that his grace is sufficient for me because he fills in the gaps so often. But it's not a privilege or a responsibility that I take lightly.
Right. Yeah. Oh, totally. Well, thank you for being
absolutely
on the podcast. This was fun.
Super fun.
We're going to do this again for sure.
Okay, cool.
Because there's definitely way more topics that I want to cover with you.
Like I said, it's scary if you go looking in this head, Dru.
Yeah, but thank you for being on.
Absolutely.
And that was awesome. So
thanks.
To the next one.
Yes, sir.